다음번에게 성로리아 도마 자시집에 참주시와.
First of all, I would like to offer you all my warmest and most auspicious greetings. Today is the fourth day of our winter teachings. It's the fourth day of the teachings, so yesterday there was something that I didn't explain clearly. They're the dharmas of Maitreya, the works of Maitreya. They're the dharmas of Maitreya as identified in the Chinese canon and the way they're identified in the Tibetan canon. And these ways are a little bit different. And so among them, the ones that are identified as being the same in the Chinese canon and the Tibetan canon. So there are many similarities between these two. So yesterday, when I spoke about the ones that are shared between the two, and I said that the Yogacarya levels is one that's held to be a work of Maitreya by both, but that is actually not correct. It is in the tradition, that is not correct, because in the Tibetan tradition, it is said that the Yogacarya levels is written by a Sangha, and in the Chinese tradition, it says that it's not written by a Sangha, instead that it's written by the protector Maitreya. So that is a difference between the Chinese and the Tibetan presentations. The others, the differentiating middle from extremes, the ornament of the sutras, and the discriminating dharmas from their nature are both held by both the Chinese and the Tibetan canons to be the works of Maitreya. And so that is a shared view. So next, what I would like to speak about next is that I will, in order to continue our discussion from yesterday, as I said yesterday, whether or not Maitreya was a historical person, basically the doubt is whether he is a person or some sort of a deity. Normally we think of Maitreya as being a deity. We don't think about him as being a human. We think about him as being a god. However, the texts that he wrote are present in our human world. So either a Sangha took notes of Maitreya's teachings, and you could say that then they were brought to the human world. Otherwise, if there are some treatise written by a god that came to the human world, then that is not such a comfortable way of saying it. In any case, there is a debate over whether Maitreya was a historical person or not. And this is an area where there certainly are questions and one might have some doubts. Sometimes the way we think about things is that we think that contemporary scholars are a bit audacious and that they look down on our traditional ways of seeing things and they dismiss them. But that's not actually the case. There are many scholars who research Buddhism who have interest in Buddhism and also and have great attachments to the Buddhist culture and affection for Buddhist culture and views. And because they have such affection for it, they wouldn't look down on it or dismiss it. And so for this reasons, they also have great regard for and great interest in the Buddhist tradition. And this is very clear. In particular, in the Japanese tradition, many of the researchers into Buddhism are themselves Buddhists. Many of them are also members of the Sangha. And their research into Buddhism is from, on the one hand, it is in order to preserve or to propagate Buddhism. It is basically to preserve the Buddhism without weakening. And so they're engaging in great work in order to for that aim. It's not, as we sometimes think, that they are just always saying all these audacious things. So if we were to think that way, it wouldn't be right. Similarly, in these days, the general international way of doing things is the way things are going. And the one aspect, this is because of the improvement in the natural sciences that have brought out things that people can see and people can hold in their hands. So if we don't have such evidence, people don't believe it. And since we've come to such a time, even when we're speaking about Buddhism, Buddhist history, since we don't have much factual evidence or factual reasons, if we say it's a traditional teaching, we say this scholar said this, and so therefore it is so. Merely saying that will not be something that people can actually feel satisfied about in their minds. For this reason, many Buddhist preachers use contemporary methods, and in order for our common perceptions, they look for the factual basis, the factual evidence. And so if we look at it from this perspective, it is something that will benefit us in spreading the Buddhist teaching, and it's something that we must have. So sometimes the way we think is just too limited, and I think that that's not right. Similarly, if we think about it from another perspective, when we're talking about in the Tibetan Buddhism or in the Tibetan society, a lot of people waste a lot of time on pointless works. They fool themselves on pointless things. If we think about the human life, it's only a few decades long. And during that time, most of the time we spend on pointless and meaningless actions. Actually, there are a lot of things we can do and that we should be doing, but we don't pay any attention to them. And we only spend our time doing meaningless things. And so we end up having a little bit of rivalry or jealousy between different schools or different religions. And people talk about the different rivalries with different people, or in our society, we think about with different groups or between individuals in society. We have a lot of differences in views, and we consider these to be extremely important and only pay attention to those. And then we waste all our time thinking about those. But actually, we don't have any time to waste. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot left for us to do. And since there's so much left for us to do, if we spend that time working on such things, then it's like we don't have time to work on anything else, but we don't think about that. This is another thing we need to think about. So the reason why I'm saying so much now is that these people are doing a lot of work whose time to do such work. And so we also need to do work whose time it is. We need to make efforts at doing this and make plans to do it. So that is my main reason and my main aim in speaking about this now. In any case, so there's debate as to whether Maitreya was a historical person or not. But regardless of that, the people who actually organized and systematized and propagated the mind-only view taught in the Sutra Unraveling the Intent were Asanga and Vasubandhu. And among them too, the Asanga was born in northern India in the land of Gandhara, in the capital of that, Purushapura. So he was born in Purushapura, the capital of the land of Gandhara. And initially, he got into the foundation vehicle and meditated and practiced that text. And what it says in the biography of Vasubandhu, translated by Master Yi Jing, it is said that he initially entered the Sarvastivada school. Now, according to the writings on the travels of Xuanzang, it was in the Mahishashaka school. In any case, he first entered a foundation vehicle and practiced the foundation vehicle practices, but he was not satisfied with them. Later, he followed Maitreya as his guru, practiced the Mahayana meditation on emptiness, and probably the meditation on emptiness. And so then, of course, here we have the question over to Maitreya was a person or not, because when we say that he followed Maitreya as a guru, generally when we talk about following someone as a guru, we're talking about one person taking another person as their teacher. That's how we normally understand it. And so if that's the way, then we'd think that Maitreya would have to be a person. So once again, the question of whether Maitreya was a person or the human or not has come up again. Now, when we think about the texts or the works written by Asanga, they include the Compendium of Abhidharma, the treatise clarifying the teachings, and the Compendium of the Mahayana. These are three. And now this academics continue to research whether it actually was a Sangha who wrote them, but it's generally accepted that it's said that they were written by a Sangha. Also a Japanese scholar, according to one Japanese scholar. He said that there are additional two texts written by Asanga. The first of these is the Similarities with the Middle Way. And so I'll give an introduction to that text later. And the second is a commentary on the Vajrasplitter Sutra. And so he says that these two are also written by Asanga. Now, when we look at the works mentioned above, and say that Asanga first meditated on emptiness according to the foundation vehicle, and then according to the Mahayana vehicle. In addition to that, in this text that is called The Similarities with the Middle Way is actually a commentary on the root verses of the Middle Way. And so the name that he called is The Similarities with the Middle Way. Likewise, he wrote a commentary on the Vajrasplitta Sutra. So looking at this, we can say that the most important background or support for Asanga's view is the view of emptiness, the view of the middle way. Not only that, it's clear that the Yogacaras levels had a very strong influence on Asanga. We spoke about the Yogacaras the other day, yesterday. Now, when we say that the Yogacara levels had a strong influence on Asanga, then the question that comes up is whether the Yogacara levels were written by Asanga or not. If we take it as a basis that Asanga was influenced by the Yogacara levels, then we'd have to say that he was not their author because they must have appeared before him, he studied them, and then they influenced him. That was how it would have had to have been. In any case, if we take it as the case that the Yogacara levels were written before Asanga, then we'd say that he based his teachings on the compendium, the Abhidharma, and the treatise clarifying the teachings on the Yogacara levels. Now, of course, he did many works and many teachings, but among them, the greatest contribution is writing the compendium of the Mahayana. Because of his writing the compendium of the Mahayana, he kind of revised and recompiled all of the different areas in the presences where the different levels and stages the Yogacara presentation were either mistaken or mixed up. And in this way established an unmistaken mind-only philosophy. So for this reason, the Mahayana, the compendium of the Mahayana is a very important text. And so then, using the basis of Asanga's thought as his philosophy, his younger brother Vasubandhu then took that and gave the mind-only philosophy a new and improved form. So that's the way it's generally explained, but among academics, as they do their research, if I give kind of an introduction to the situation with academic research, there are 4 different translations of the compendium of the Mahayana. And I think this is only in the Chinese. I don't know whether the Tibetan is included here. But it said that there are 4 different translations of the compendium of the Mahayana. And so with these 4 translations, when they are compared, the situation that becomes evident is that there are many important points of the Yogacara mind-only period that appear in the 2 later translations, but not in the earlier ones. So the same text, the translation of the same text, but the text of the 2 are different. There are points that appear, points of the view of the mind-only that appear in the later texts, but do not in the earlier texts. And now, the biggest difference among all of the differences, on all the different translations, there's the compendium translated by Master Yi Jing, that is the compendium that he translated. These are differ the most significantly from the other translations. Now, even though there are differences in the translations, if you look at the overall structure of the of the text of the compendium, what we can understand from that is that the Mahayana is a very systematically organized text. It has a great system and organization. And so that from the very beginning, it is very systematic. So we can understand this from looking at it. So like I would think about how is it that the compendium or the main parts of the compendium originated, and primarily it takes as its basis the views of the practitioners of the Mahayana that they developed from their own practice. And then on the basis of that, created a structural presentation of the view of the mind only, and then created the compilation that was later done. And so regarding this, academics basically have no dispute about that. Because it's when at the time the compendium was written, the mind-only view was basically more or less fully developed and had already had its own system in order. And so for that reason, and there's no doubt that among academics that the compendium was written after the mind-only view had been systematized. Now, when we talk about who the author of the compendium was, there are different opinions about this, I think. There's one Japanese scholar who says, according to the one Japanese scholar, he holds that the Sangha wrote the entire compendium himself. Now, others have slightly different ideas. They said it wasn't written by a Sangha alone, but it instead is written by many people in collaboration. So there are people who do hold this opinion. Now, another text that is said to have been written by a Sangha is called the Treatise Clarifying the Teachings. When I talk about this Treatise Clarifying the Teachings, what that is it's not in Tibetan. However, there is this Treatise Clarifying the Teachings in Chinese. And what researchers say about this text is that after some disciples had, after the Yogacara levels had been completed, it was written after they had compiled and added a bit to the Yogacara levels. Then there's also the compendium of the Abhidharma. Now, the basis for this is primarily the Yogacara levels. Now, within the Yogacara levels, there are many different lists of Dharma. And so they compiled these lists, and they made it as like a lexicon, like a dictionary or a compilation of terminology. And so they assert that it is this sort of a lexicon. And so then the compendium of the Mahayana, it's like, is that they had the intention of compiling the meaning or the crucial points of the Mahayana into one text. And then also in the compendium of the Mahayana, there's like the complete and the full presentation of the mind-only philosophy. So it was written at a time when the mind-only philosophy had already been established. So now, So the treatise clarifying the teachings and the compendium of the Abhidharma and the compendium of the Mahayana, if you ask, were these all written by a single person named Asanga, then it's difficult to say that exactly so. But if we look at the way they're put together, we think that they're at least related or linked to Asanga. But saying that it is just only one, categorically one historical Asanga who wrote them, that's a difficult postulate to make. So when we talk about, well, who was the historical Acharya Asanga then? So who is this historical Asanga? So it could have been that at the beginning, there were several practitioners who had views and ideas. They had views and ideas, the views from their meditation, right? That, had similar vows that arose from their experience and realization, and then they had the same aim and basically the same system. And they took these views and thoughts and they compiled and reworked the material. And so that could be what the name refers to. If we say that it was that there was the reason why we can't say it's necessarily just a single person who wrote the compendium of the Abhidharma, the clarifying the teachings, and the compendium of the Mahayana is that one thing that happened in ancient India and also continue happens in this age is that when many people collaborate to create a text or a work, then they take the name of the most important or the most well-known person. Everyone works together, but they take the most well-known person's name and they accredited it to that one name. And so, for example, if we think about the compendium of the Mahayana, for example, it has been passed down over several centuries, right? And as it's become down to us over several centuries, there's a problem with a lot of editing done on it. For example, if we think about it in Tibetan, there have been many people who have proofread and edited the tentures. And when they proofread them, they might have slightly different understandings. And it seems that there may have been people who have added to them, people who have actually changed, either added or taken away parts of it. And so in that respect, we say that in the beginning, there was the text of the compendium of Mahayana that was written and the one that we can see now. So it's quite possible that there would be quite a few differences between the two. It's quite possible that there are so many differences, but you cannot categorically say that it was not written by Asanga. And the reason for this is that even there have been many changes, but still this text's earlier philosophical orientation still remains there, and it's not weakened and not diminished. So for that reason, we could say that it was written by Asanga and use his name. But the way we think about things, when we say that Asanga wrote something, what we now immediately think is that Asanga himself then squirreled himself away in the depths of some house. He took a pen in his hand and he alone sat down writing everything himself, and then gave it directly to our hands. But we can't think of it in that way. And the reason is that the compendium of the Mahayana that we have in our hands now is not something that Asanga wrote down himself and then placed in our hands. It came through many people for many hundreds of years, gone from one person to the next. And so how many times was it edited in between them? I mean, how many changes were made to the text? And when we look at this, there have been a lot of changes. There have been a whole lot of changes. Because there have been so many changes, the compendium of Mahayana that has come to our hands, if we say this was written by Asanga, if we say we can't 100% say that Asanga wrote 100% of the text. There's been so many, so much editing and so many additions, so many subtractions that we can't definitely say that he wrote it. But we can't say that it wasn't written by Asanga because the structure and the organization were all developed by Asanga, and that was all taken based on that. So we can't say it wasn't. So what we need to think about it is that whether we think about the Yogacarya mind only, or the many practitioners have considered Asanga to be an incredibly important figure. And they've had very strong feeling, a profound feeling of blessings. And when they've had that strong feeling, and so in the way many people think of it like with the compendium of Mahayana, many people think that from the one perspective that they were spreading it. From another aspect, they were preserving the text. Another angle, they're also compiling and editing and adding and subtracting. And so if we think about it from another angle, what we should say is the people, it's the older generations who have given us the compendium Mahayana that we actually have. And so we should think of them with gratitude. And because of them, that we are actually able to have hold in our hands the text of the compendium of the Mahayana. So this is another important point that we need to think about. So the next one was Vasubandhu. And now Vasubandhu was also similar to Asanga in that he first entered the foundation vehicle Sarvastivada, and he was well known for being extremely intelligent. And he was so well regarded and famous as a scholar that so he was well known all over India. Later, if we talk about it in the traditional way, his elder brother Asanga, then under the influence by Asanga, he then entered the Mahayana, and then he compiled and organized the mind only vow. He gave it an order and compiled it. And so he had a very strong effect left strong traces in the mind only Yogacarya view. So now, when you think about it, but there's some important points from the research about Vasubandhu. As I said in at the end of the 19th century, the academics studying Buddhism began to research the dates of Vasubandhu's birth and his death. And so beginning that, there was a great, the beginning of the research into the Yogacarya and mind only. So the very beginning was that they were trying to determine the dates of Vasubandhu's birth and death. Now, at that time, there are two primary positions about Vasubandhu's dates. The first is that he was born in the 4th century, and the other was he was born in the 5th century. So there are these two positions. And so the idea they gave him two different sets of dates. And once there were the two sets of dates, in 1951, there was a scholar named Frau Wallner. And this scholar said, at that time, they had the two different positions, that he was in the 4th century and the 5th century. And so Frau Wallner took that as the basis and said that there must have been two Vasubandhus who appeared in one of the 2 centuries. And so you had the position that there were 2 Vasubandhus, one earlier and one later. And so what he's saying here is that it's basically saying there were 2 Vasubandhus, one appeared later and one appeared later. So he said there are 2 Vasubandhus. Now, we're not talking about how many people named Vasubandhu there were, but we're talking about the famous or the important people named Vasubandhu. There were 2. So the earlier one, he said, was the Asanga, his younger brother, who lived in the 4th century, who, under the influence of Asanga, moved from being in the Sarvastivada tradition into being in the Mahayana. And so that was the earlier Vasubandhu. And so this is the Vasubandhu who entered the Mahayana, who wrote about the mind only. Then there was also the later Vasubandhu, and this is the author of the Treasury of the Abhidharma. And when he appeared was in the 5th century. And he was also originally a Sarvastivadin, and then later entered the Sutra school. And so that is how Frau Wallner explains it. Now, I can't really pronounce Frau Wallner, but within academics, there is a great interest in Frau Wallner's hypothesis of 2 Vasubandhus, and it was very influential. And it became generally accepted that there must have been 2 Vasubandhus. Now, the main sources that he used for his hypothesis were several different texts. And among them, the first of these, the first set of these included the life of Vasubandhu translated into Chinese by Yi Jing. That was one of his important sources. The second was Xuanzang's records of his travels to India. The third was in terms of Tibetan, Bhutan's Dharma history and Taranata's Dharma history. And so these were his primary sources. But these are the primarily, most of these are all basically traditional accounts. And so Yi Jing's account was actually a traditional account. It's not that there was an actual historical distinction. It was the traditional account passed down from past masters. Tang Xuanzang's account records the traditional accounts that people told him that had been passed down from previous generations. And Bhutan's Dharma history and Taranata's Dharma history also primarily give the traditional accounts passed down from earlier masters. And so for that because there are very few written historical records about Vasubandhu himself. And so for that reason, he basically had a very strong attachment to the traditional accounts. And that's something we must understand. Now, the second set of the second source that he had, or the text attributed to Vasubandhu in the Chinese canon. In the Chinese canon, there are many different texts that are attributed to Vasubandhu, and so he used them as another source. Now, the third set was the accounts given in Vasumitra's commentary in the Treasury of Abhidharma and other commentaries by later masters. So basically, and so he used So these accounts given by later masters such as Vasamitra were a source that he used in coming up with this hypothesis. And so when we look at those, that the Ravana hypothesized that there were two Vasubandhus, but the sources that he used were primarily traditional accounts. So primarily they're traditional accounts. And if they're traditional accounts, they're just traditional accounts, oral accounts. With them, there's a lot that must have been true stories, but they also have many made-up parts. So if we want to use traditional accounts to get an entirely clear picture of the actual historical, it's extremely difficult. So for this reason, there were probably quite a few people who objected to his postulate that there were two Vasubandhus at that time. Among them, there's a Japanese academic named Hirakawa Akira who writes that what he says is, in India, there are many different texts that are said to be written by one famous person. This is like a tradition. Even though they weren't written by the same person, there is a tradition of saying that they're written by the same person. In particular, the Vasubandhu, there is also Vasumitra. And these two names in Sanskrit are very well known. And the reason for that is that the word Vasu is the name of a god. Because it's the name of a god, many people have such faith in the god that they call it Vasu this, Vasu that. And so there's a tradition of naming people Vasu. Likewise, if we look in the Buddhist histories, we can't necessarily say there's no certainty that there's Vasubandhu as just one person. In fact, there are many Vasubandhus in Buddhist history. Also within the Yogacaryas, the Vasubandhus are considered Yogacaryas to be very famous and important. So it's quite possible that they would say that the author of their text would have been Vasubandhu. For example, I'd like to give it as like if we think about it in terms of Tibet. This is not something that the Japanese scholar said, but in order to make it easy for us, we need to use a Tibetan example, right? So what we Tibetans say, we say that so even if there's no place in Tibet where our Guru Rinpoche has gone. So wherever you go in Tibet, so if you go any place you go, Rinpoche said this, and there's Rinpoche's footprint and so forth. But if you think about an actual history, now of course this can happen in pure visions, but in the actual historical basis, when Guru Rinpoche went to Tibet, basically, most people say he spent no more than 18 months. And so in 18 months, it was difficult to go to all the places in Tibet. No, if he went by miraculous powers, and this would have been pure visions, but in our common perceptions, he couldn't have gone. Of course, he could have gone by miraculous perception and common perception, but most people, but when you talk about too many miraculous or incredible things, it's just not something that fits within our common perceptions. So in Tibet, no matter where you go, there are stories about Guru Rinpoche. And so in India, with the Yogacaryas, when they had their important texts, they would say this is written by their earlier famous masters. Likewise, when you think about the Yogacaryas, they're primarily practitioners, right? And because they were practitioners, they considered their god, their deities and their gurus to be extremely important. And so in order to show their devotion and respect, they would use it. It happened that they would use their name. We can't say you aren't allowed to do that. These people had such great faith, and they used it out of faith and devotion. They aren't use it in order to show themselves off. And we can't say that it's not right to use the names in that way. In any case, we have the traditional accounts of Vasubandhu's life translated into Chinese by Yi Jing. These are primarily traditional accounts. And if we use them, rely on them too heavily as our sources, then this leads to the situation that there are a lot of questions and debates about things such as the dates of Vasubandhu. So one person will say that this is will follow the tradition of Yi Jing, another will follow another person, and between the two of them, we're going to say that my source is better than yours, and you can't necessarily that it's difficult to say categorically that it's not so. And this happens within Tibetan. If you have some great scholar, if this scholar says, and if you don't accept it, then you're not considering that scholar to be learned. And that's how we see it, isn't it? And so we'd always be saying who is being disrespectful to whom, and we'd be continually in debate. So in brief, when we're researching Indian history and researching the Yogacara history, the difficult thing is that there are not any actual factual historical differences. There aren't any ancient written historical manuscripts. And because there aren't these, and if everything is a traditional account or an oral account, it's not reliable. It's not certain. And because it's not certain, or then we're thinking about historical persons or the events of history, it's impossible to say it happened exactly when it happened. And this leads to many debates. So what I often think is that the ancient Indian people didn't think about future generations at all. At that time, they thought nothing about the future generations. And they're so amazed by what's happening in front of them. And they think, if I see this is fine. And they didn't think at all about the people of the future. Forget about them. We can't forget about anything else. We can't even say the date that the Buddha passed into party nirvana with any certainty. At the time that the Buddha was in there, there were many different kings. And if the kings had it recorded, if they had recorded it in their palaces somehow, we'd have something we could look at. But they didn't record anything. They didn't write a single word about it. And so when Ashoka wrote a few words on pillars, and we can then have some confidence that there was a Buddha who appeared, and that he probably was probably born in this century. We can probably guess this, right? But otherwise, if Ashoka hadn't carved these inscriptions in pillars, then forget about when the Buddha, the dates of the Buddha's appearance. Then it would be difficult for us to have any evidence at all that the Buddha had appeared. We'd say there was just a Buddha that appeared. It's written on later histories, but we need some evidence. So modern people need some evidence from that time, and finding the evidence would be extremely difficult. So the rock inscriptions and pillars of Ashoka were really beneficial to us. But if the earlier kings had done that, then it would have been great. They didn't make any inscriptions, and because they didn't make any inscriptions, and most of the history basically comes from Indian oral histories and Tibetan oral histories. And we look at the Tibetan and the So there's just one person saying something to another. There is difference because they're noticing basically from one person saying an oral into another person's ear and hearing it. If we think about it, the stories of our own histories, if we talk about this, you say to, if you tell one person your life story one day and you tell it to someone else the next day, it changes a little bit, right? It changes. It changes. And so when you tell it yourself, there changes. And when that person then tells it to someone else, then of course it's going to change a bit more. And if it goes through 100 people, then you have no idea what's going to come out at the end. There's a danger that they'll say things that you did things you didn't do, that you didn't do things you did do, and so there'll be absolutely no certainty in evidence. Now, of course, there are probably actual events in there, historical events, but that you can't say that there's nothing true in it. But there's a lot of difficulty otherwise. So, but this is not saying that it's 100% not correct. So now we will have our 30-minute intermission. I'll continue. Now, in 1958, there was an Indian scholar named Jaini, Padmanabha S. Jaini. And what he says is that the treasury of Abhidharma and the lamp of Abhidharma, he was researching these two texts, the treasury of Abhidharma and the lamp of Abhidharma. So in talking about the treasury of Abhidharma takes the positions of the Foundation's Vehicle Sutra School. So in one respect, the treasury of Abhidharma takes the foundational positions, and in the other respects, it takes the Mahayana view. Now, in the treatise called The Lamp of Abhidharma, there are some refutations of the treasury of Abhidharma. Then, in addition to that, the author of the treasury, which is in Sanskrit, is called the Koshakara. This means the author of the treasury of Abhidharma. Much of the text within the treasury of Abhidharma is very similar to two different texts. One is called the Vetulika Shastra. If we translate this into Tibetan, I can't really exactly say what it would be in Tibetan, but it is the name of a text. My video got lost. It's the name of a text. And there's another term for another name for the text. In any case, the text of the treasury is very similar. The text is very similar to the Vetulika Shastra. So there are many similarities between the treasury of Abhidharma and the Vetulika Shastra. So that is one point. Because there are so many similarities, one reason why the Lamp of the Abhidharma refutes or raises objections to the treasury of the Abhidharma is because there are so many points that are taken from this Vetulika Shastra. Now, a third point. The text from the Vetulika Shastra uses many words that are very similar to the Mahayana, It gives many similar proofs as the Mahayana. And so the basic summary of all of this is that the teachings on the two truths and so forth within the tradition, within the treasury of Abhidharma, are very similar to the presentation of the three characteristics. It's like he's taking the presentation of the three characteristics as the basis. So that is one summary that he made. No, so what Frauwaner, the scholar Frauwaner, said is that the author of the treasury of Abhidharma was a later Vasubandhu, a Vasubandhu who had not entered the Mahayana. So it was a Vasubandhu who had not developed the Mahayana view. So that's what Frauwaner says. But what the refutation that Jayani makes of that is that in the treasury of Abhidharma, there are many passages that show a Mahayana orientation. And there's also this presentation of the three characteristics. So it is not correct to say that the author of the treasury of Abhidharma did not have a Mahayana orientation. Now, another point. He also gave many bits of evidence that the author of the treasury had a Mahayana vow, because the scholar Frauwaner used as his primary bit of evidence for saying there are two earlier and later Vasubandhus, is because he thought that the author of the treasury did not have a Mahayana view. He did not teach the Mahayana teachings, and therefore the author of the Mahayana treatise, in particular the Yogacarya, the text treatises of the Yogacarya in the mind only, was a different Vasubandhu. They could not have been the same as the author of the treasury of the Abhidharma. Now Jayani refuted this, saying that it could not. Now, in the 1980s, there are three Japanese scholars, and I don't need to mention their name, and so they continued their own research, and they took they continued and also supported the position by the Indian scholar Jaini. So this Indian scholar Jaini said that if we look at the text itself and examine its text, if we look at the work itself and examine the text, then we can see that the treasury of Abhidharma, from the treasury of the text, we can see that it's not okay to say that there must have been an earlier and later Vasubandhu. And so this is a very influential proof that he had. And it's a very powerful proof that he gave. Then in the second scholar was the scholar named Lambert and Schmidhausen. So Schmidhausen is a German academic. And in 1967, what he said is that when we need to have these two criteria for judging. When you talk about Vasubandhu, if we're going to decide who Vasubandhu was and what his view was, and when we were researching Vasubandhu, there are two methods or two logics that we can use. And he used these two criteria for determining whether it was Vasubandhu or not. And the first is the idea of the Sutra school of a single stream of consciousness. Now, this is a term that he himself came up with and applied to it. So in German, it's ein einschichtiger Erkenntnisstrom. So it's German, and I can't read German. So basically, the Sutra school's position of the single stream of consciousness, and then there's another criteria: is the Yogacarya association of the complex of streams of consciousness. And so this is der Erkenntnisstromkomplex des Yogacarens. So now German is very difficult, and I don't know it well. But it is a Yogacarya assertion of a complex of streams of consciousness. So there's basically two different views. So these are like two different criteria in the site. So the sutra is going to talk about the sutra single stream of consciousness, saying that you say the mind, intellect, and consciousness are all the same. This is a position of the Sutra school. When you talk about the Yogacara assertion of the complex of streams of consciousness, so what this is talking about is we use the word chitta, that in mind, that refers primarily to the grounded. The manas, or intellect, refers primarily to the afflicted mind, and consciousness, or vijnana, applies to the six consciousnesses. And that is the Yogacara position. So using these two different criteria and these methods as a way to research, so using these two criteria to analyze and research, he reanalyzed the text of the treasury, the proof of karma, the 20 verses, and the 30 verses. And as he did his research, his final conclusion that all of these texts, the treasury, the proof of karma, the 20 verses, and the 30 vows, that all of these texts were really very clearly conformed to the Sutra school's position of a single layer, a single stream of consciousness. And so for this reason, he said that they must have all been written by a single author. So that was his conclusion. Now, his investigation was very detailed, and we don't have time to talk about it. And so we don't need to go in it now. But to give a basic presentation, or a basic overview of it now, the way we can explain it simply So when you talk about the Sutra school presentation of a single layer stream of consciousness, how does it come out in this? So how does we say that how do you use this idea of the Sutra school single layer stream of consciousness presentation as proof that they're all written by the same author? If you look at the order of these, the stages of these texts, and so in terms of the order, he said the first is the proof of karma, and what is discussed in there, that teaches the ground consciousness. That is probably the first text, the first work that gives the presentation of the ground consciousness. The next is the 20 verses. And within the 20 verses, there is the mind, which in the Sanskrit is chitta. Then there's manas, which is like intellect. And then there is vijnana, which is consciousness. So vijnana. It says that these three are synonymous. Not only are they said to be synonymous, he uses the particular mind-only jargon, or the mind-only term. He talks about so he talked about the term, the vigyapti matrata, so the mind-only present, the mind-onliness. Now, in the 30 verses, when we take a look at that, Vasubandhu uses the word chitta primarily for the ground consciousness. So chitta is primarily for the ground consciousness, and manas is primarily for the afflicted mind, and vijnana is understood as the sixth mental consciousness. And so he uses these as the basis for teaching the awareness-only positions. So when we take a look at these texts, first you have the position of the ground conscious, then you have the position about the synonym, the nature of the mind, intellect, and conscious being synonymous, and at the same time asserting the mind-only view. And then even more subtle than that, in the 30 verses, the mind referring to the ground consciousness, intellect referring to the afflicted mind, and so forth. And so these occurred in a sequence, and so for that reason, and when you look at Vasubandhu's works, we see the differences, the changes that occur, the developments that occurred in his thought, and how the Yogacarya view became clearer. So when Schmidhausen talked about the actual text, comparing the actual text of these works, and using these new proofs or this new criteria, Schmidhausen concluded that the treasury, the proof of karma, the 20 verses and the 30 verses were all written by a single person, and said that the author was the author of the treasury. And so this is his summary. Actually, one strange thing we have to understand, something very strange about this situation, is that this scholar, Schmidhausen, when he was doing his research, his original aim there was Frau Wallner who asserted that there are two Vasubandhus, and so he wanted to support that tradition, and that was his original aim. But as he was doing his research, in the end, the conclusion that came out, the conclusion was that it's not correct to say that there are two Vasubandhus, that there were not an earlier and later, that there is a one. The author of the treasure, the author of the Yogacarya and mind-only treatises were all one person. And so his original intention and his conclusion were different. In any case, his logic refuting that there were an earlier and later Vasubandhu was very powerful. And so that was that. And so for that reason, Schmidhausen's new logic Schmidhausen used a new logic. So, excuse me, once Schmidhausen used this new logic, it entered a new era of scholarship. And the reason why this is a groundbreaking method is that we've talked about is instead of relying on traditional accounts, instead he looked at the actual text and structure of this. And in this way, he began a new method of research. This was like a new stage of research or a new historical stage. And in addition, many of the people who engage in research into the Yogacara school primarily uses their method examining the structure and the text of the various works. Now there's a question that comes up here. When we talk about Schmidhausen, the result of Schmidhausen's research was that these texts, the proof of karma, the 20 verses and the 30 verses, were taken from the idea of the Sutra school of the single layer stream of consciousness. So they're very similar to that. So they took that as the basis and then developed that. And so when I speak about that, in order to understand that, we need to figure out who are the Dodepa? What is the Sutra school? Was there actually a Sutra school or not? And if there was one, then what sort of a school was it? What was it like? So this is the question that comes up. And regarding this question, the person who gave a very good answer to this was a Japanese scholar who gave a good answer to this question. And the name of this Japanese scholar was Kato Junjo. Kato Junsho. Now, what this Kato Junjo said in a 1989 publication, after he did research into the treasury and a text called the Jnanaya Sarani, the Sutra on Entering Logic. And when he researched these texts, and as he examined these texts, in the end, his conclusion, so he spent a long time doing his research, and the ultimate conclusion was that the Sutra school or the Santra school first appeared in the treasury of Abhidharma. So it originated from the treasury of Abhidharma. Usually, so this first appeared in the term Sutra school comes from the treasury of Abhidharma. And before that, there was a master, Sri Labdha. There was a position that had been started by a master called Sri Labdha. But instead, differently from that, what he said is that the Sutra school, the word Satyananda first comes from the treasury of Abhidharma. And before the treasury of Abhidharma, there was no term for the Sutra school. And so what this shows is that There's the author of the treasury. The author of the treasury, so the Vasubandhu, who was the author of the treasury, was not only well versed in the foundation view, but he was also very highly trained in the mind only, the Yogacara view. Not only that, there's a lot about the Sutra school in the Abhidharma, and most of these talks show that they're actually very close to the Yogacara views. Now, then later, there were two scholars. There's a Japanese scholar. What's his name? This is his name. There's a Japanese, as he continued to research, the situation became very common. Now, this Japanese scholar's name is Sakuma Hidenori. So Sakuma Hidenori in the 1990s wrote a publication. And what he said is that the positions that are found in the treasury, most of these positions actually can be found in the Yogacara levels. So you can find these positions in the Yogacara Bhumi, the Yogacara levels text. So within the treasury of Abhidharma, there are many different positions of the Sutra school that are taught, and what these are is that Vasubandhu, when he was taking for the Yogacara position, when he was speaking about this, he primarily took the Yogacara position to make his refutations of the Sarvastivada. And it's a way that talking about the Sutra school was a way that he used to speak to the Sarvastivada school. For example, if you speak to someone who speaks English, you can't speak to them in Tibetan. They won't understand. So for the same reason, when you talk to the Sarvastivada, when you take the mind-only school and speak to them, they're the Yogacara terms and the Yogacara view. And if you only take those as a basis when you speak to them, then they will not understand what you're saying. And it's because we have to talk about everyone has to have like a common perception, because there's no common perception between the people. In order to give things that people commonly accept, then you had to speak in ways that other people can accept. And so for that reason, Vasubandhu when Vasubandhu spoke to the Great Exhibition from the angle of the Vajrayana, he used these Sutra school positions to speak to them. There are also Sutra school positions in the 20 verses, and what these are is that there is someone who is objecting, so that there are many outer and internal schools who object to the position of everything by being mind only, and so he takes the position of a Sutra school in order to make it a rejection. So the positions of the Sutra school presented in the treasury and the positions of the Sutra school presented in the 20 verses, and both of these are ways to give good explanations of Yogacara positions to other people. And and he used them as a way to debate with people who did not accept the mind-only Yogacara position. So it's a way of speaking, a way of addressing others. So when we look at that, is that the Sutra school view was in order to have a common language when it was a way that the Yogacara masters used to have a common language when speaking with people of other schools. Now, as I've mentioned, the Yogacara is a practice that was primarily was a school that primarily emphasized practice. And so the aim and the purpose of the school was actually different than other schools. And so when they're having debates with other schools, then either you have to have a similar perceptions, or you have to have you're talking about them in the same stage, in the same arena. Then everyone has to have. If you only talk from your own particular ideas, then the other people will not really understand it well. Or the discussion will not be clear and easily understandable. And so in order to speak in a way that fit with the general way that things understand in the world, and so for this reason, they developed the Sutra school. To give an example of this, in the chair of the practice siddhas, the text by Eighth Karmapa Mikyo Dorje, when speaking about the borders between holding different views. What he says at this point is that there are two ways you can give an answer. You can give, there's one way is to give the particular answers that are given in the Eighth Karmapa's chair to the practitioners, or there is another way of giving an answer in a way that accords with other people's views. And when you give the answer according to our own particular interests, in actuality, is closer to the view expressed in Mikyo Dorje's chair to the practice cities. However, but when you're debating with other schools, for example, when if we are holding as our position the views presented in Eighth Karmapa's chair to the practice cities, so when you have the opponents or the other schools, the Sakya, Gelug, and so forth, the person from the other school will not clearly understand that the terms and the differentiations given our own particular school. And so if you don't have a general way of presenting things so that then the other people won't understand it. Because if you say one thing, then the other person won't understand. So if you say that this is the East, the other person is in the West, then the people won't understand. As an example, you say, is there a monastery? You say, why? They didn't know. And so if you engage in debate about whether there's a monastery or not, and if you don't have any positions, and so and basically you have to give the answer that I have no assertions. That's the particular response. If you then if you say, then people will say, but actually your assertion is that you have no assertions. But if you talk about this, the other person can't say then. And so like people just want to understand what you're saying. It's like there's no understanding between the speakers. So you have to have a common way of speaking, a common language, a common way a common manner of speaking. And so it's similar to that. That's a similar understanding that comes up here when it's discussing how the Sutra school originated. When the mind-only Yogacara were speaking about the Sarvastivada, and Yogacara positions are just completely different, and the way they speak about things is different. And so in order to have a common language and common perception when speaking about them, then if you speak from the perspective of the Sutra school, then not only is it something that the other person will be able to accept and will accept more easily, but it's that they'll be able to understand it more easily, so you'll be able to have real communication and convince them. Now, so earlier we spoke about Schmidhausen concluded that Vasubandhu was the author of the Treasury, the proof of karma, the 20 verses in the 30th sentence, and he gave the proof that they're all written by a single author. And then in the 80s, there was a Japanese scholar. Now, this Japanese scholar's name is this Japanese scholar is Matsuda Kazunoba. And so what he said is, so he, in addition to the works that Schmidhausen exerted, he added 2 additional works. And these 2 additional works, and what they are were, first is the logic of explanations, and the action was the explanation of interdependence. And so he said that these were also written by the Vasubandhu, the author of the Treasury. So the order of this that he put, when he did as similarly to Schmidt, and according to Schmidhausen's results, he arranged the order that writing the text. So first he said that the logic of explanations, then the proof of karma, and then the explanation of interdependence, then the 20 verses, and then the 30 verses. And he said that the author of this, the Koshakara, the author of the Treasury, Vasubandhu, was the author of all of these. And so he came up with this position, and this is, these days, most academics accept this research. And this is another important point. Now, in addition, there was a Japanese scholar. There's the same one, Matsuda Kazunoba. There's a Matsuda Kazunoba, and then in addition, there is also Hakamaya Noriaki. So these 2, when they're researching the Abhidharma, the Treasury of Abhidharma, within the Treasury, there's the term Purvacharya. And this Purvacharya appears 11 times. And what it means is the past teacher, the master of the past. And the master of the past is actually a work that's connected with the Yogacharya view in school. It's a term connected to the Yogacharya school. And in particular, the Japanese scholar Japanese scholar Hakamaya Noriaki, the way he summarized this is that this word, Purvacharya, the master of the past, is in the Yogacara an honorific term used for masters for whom we have great faith and confusion. Like the same way we talk about the Kagyu forefathers or the masters of the past. So when you talk about the Purvacharya, is like a way of expressing great respect for the earlier great masters of the Yogacara school. So it is a word used as an honorific. And so for that reason, there is a commentary on the Treasury by Yashomitra. And so in that, he writes that the Asanga is the Purvacharya, the earlier master. And so thus we can discern that among the different compilers of the Yogacara was Asanga. There was one of these. And that it was also included as held in very high esteem by the Yogacara school. But as whether to see whether that Asanga, whether he actually was the Asanga, an individual who was an elder brother of Vasubandhu, it's difficult to say that for certain. However, we knew that there is a master named Asanga, and that is very considered and very important in the Yogacara tradition. We can pretty much say this. So now traditionally when we talk about Asamgan, when we speak about Asambanga and Vasubandhu, we say that they're brothers. One is the elder and one is the younger brother. We have a tradition of saying this, and what is this? So does this mean that they necessarily had a family connection? It's difficult to say that. And people are still investigating this. But if we think about it in another direction, in another example, sometimes when we talk about brothers, doesn't necessarily mean to have a familiar connection of familial blood. Sometimes it can be like talking about masters and students who are very close, feel very close in mind. And maybe if you think about that, it's in that way, it's less complicated. To give like an example of this, we often talk about the three Kadampa brothers, Potawa, and the other. And so we always think that they're actually, when I was young, I thought that they're all the same in the same family. But actually, when you think about it, the three Kadampa brothers are not all the same family. But because they had very strong connection as friends, they became like real brothers, and even stronger than real brothers. They had such great love and such feelings of affection for each other. And so for that reason, they're called the brothers. And so it's similar here. Perhaps Asanga and Vasubandhu, when we say that they're brothers, is show that either that they have a really close connection as master and student, or as being friends. And then the name brothers was given to them later by their students. So to conclude, one thing I'd like to explain to all of you is, when we think about there are many works that were written by Vasubandhu, as I mentioned before. So which of these works are connected to the mind only? There's the 20 verses, the 30 verses, the proof of karma, the 5 aggregates, the 100 gates of Dharma, the treatise on the Buddha family, and then commentaries on the ornament of Mahayana Sutras, distinguishing the middle from extremes, and the compendium of the Mahayana. Now, I didn't explain this clearly when talking about the compendium of Mahayana. I didn't explain it. When you talk about there's the verses of the compendium of Mahayana. This is not the commentary. This is the root text. In this root text, I said there are 4 different, and there are 3 translations in Chinese and 1 in Tibetan. So in total, there are 4 translations of the compendium of Mahayana. Now, among these works of Vasubandhu, there's the 20 verses and the 30 verses. And then the 30 verses you all know, because it's the topic of our teaching. The proof of karma is in Tibetan. There's probably also is also in Sanskrit. The 5 aggregates is in Tibetan. The 100 gates of Dharma is also in Tibetan. And this is a text that's very important in Chinese. And when you begin to study the mind-only view, you study a text called as a preliminaries, you recite a text, this text that Vasubandhu's work called The 100 Gates of Dharma. This is the first text, as well as the text by Xuanzang, the 8 verses delineating consciousnesses. This is like shows the delineations of the 8 consciousnesses. And so there's a tradition is to begin by studying with these texts, the 100 Gates of Dharma by Vasubandhu, and the 8 verses of delineating consciousness. Now there's the 8 verses delineating the consciousness I've translated in Tibetan, but I am not really happy with it. And so I'm a little bit shy to show it to you. Now, if it turns out well, then I will show it to all of you. So the treatise of the 100 Gates of the Dharma is in the Tibetan Tenjura, and the one that is in the Tenjura was translated from the Chinese. Now the 6th is a special one. It's the treatise on the Buddha family, and what this is, it's a commentary on the Sublime Continuum. The commentary on 3 of the chapters, not the only one, not the entire. Now, this is also debate whether this is written by Vasubandhu or not, but this treatise on the Buddha family, later when we're speaking about the topic of the Sublime Continuum, is a text that we have to pay particular attention to, that we'll need to consider. And I also thought I ought to speak about this. This is related to it. And we have to mark the treasury of Abhidharma. I've spoken about it quite a bit. I said that the connection between the treasury of Abhidharma and the mind only. I've spoken of quite a bit about that, right? In the old days in Japan, when they were studying the mind only, the first thing they would study would be the treasury of Abhidharma. They would spend 8 years studying the treasury of Abhidharma, and then after that, they would spend 2 or 3 years studying the mind only. So this is what they say. So they considered the treasury of Abhidharma to be extremely important. And the master of the past must definitely have known that there is a connection between the two. So in brief, what really distinguishes Vasubandhu is that first he studied the text of the foundation vehicle, then he entered the Mahayana and studied the text, and he had profound explanations to the works of Maitreya and Asanga. And he took what was different from earlier ideas, and he compiled them all, and then he used his own particular thought and his own incredible intelligence to compile them. So this is Vasubandhu. Had a very great influence and kindness towards Buddhism in general, and particularly for the mind-only school. Now, Vasubandhu was so had studied the texts very, very easily, and he had such great intelligence that he naturally had a great ability to compile and organize and make a structure. He'd be able to take many different texts and bring them together. So he was very skilled and had a great capacity to do so. So there are many different positions, especially those from the period of schools, many different presentations of different schools and positions, and he would take all these different positions and compile them all, and he did quite a bit of work in this area. And among them, there are the 20 verses and the 30 verses are like the extremely important texts of the mind only. Generally, in the way in the way it's described by Chinese masters, the 20 verses is used to refute their opponents, and the 30 verses to prove their own position. So in the 20 verses, he used really powerful reason to refute the realists, those who assert that there are real external objects, refuting everyone who do not hold that all phenomena are mind. So it's basically a treatise to refute. And then later, in the 20 verses, there is the root text by Vasubandhu and a commentary by Vasubandhu. Now, in the latter part of his life, the last text that he wrote was the 30 verses of the mind only. Now, the 30 verses, in addition to the previous presentations of the mind only, he added his own particular thought. Now, it's only 30 verses long, but the entire mind-only philosophy is taught really well in that short text. And so this is one of the works from the latter works of Vasubandhu, a very important work of Vasubandhu. But it is a later work. And soon after he wrote it, he passed away. And so for that reason, he did not write his own auto-commentary on this. But later, many Yogacara masters made mind-only explanations. And now, among them, there are 10 different authors of commentaries on it. And so, since they're because they're the 10 masters who wrote each wrote their own commentaries, so they're called the 10 authors of the commentaries. In any case, in any case, the text by Vasubandhu that gives a known autonomous presentation of the mind-only philosophy is this 30 verses. Now, later in China, there are many, there's a great Unshan, who is a modern master and a great scholar, and what he says, I mean, take the Vasubandhu really emphasized the view that there are no external objects, only mind. And so he emphasized its point that there are no external objects. And so for that reason, the mind was given this widely known name of mind only. And the reason it was given this name is because Vasubandhu emphasized so strongly the idea that everything is awareness, everything is mind, that it was given the name mind only. And so in addition to that, it also became a school that was comparable to the Middle Way school. Now, at that time, the Middle Way school was a very widespread. And then the mind only then spread also, and it became a philosophical school that is able to hold its own against the Middle Way. And so when you talk about the Mahayana, the primary schools, we talk about one is the Middle Way and one is the mind only. So when you say the mind only, the primary reason why there was such a complete and complete presentation was because of Vasubandhu appearing, and in particular to his view that there are no external objects, that objects do not truly, and his view that there's everything is only awareness. And so it's because of the emphasis. So that's, I think, all there is for today. That's all I have to say. So now we will recite the dedication prayers.
Jai